Hello and welcome to the Selah podcast. My name is Jacob and I am joined with Skylar Farley. We've been on a 21-day fast here at the Refuge and we're coming to the end of it. And over the course of Selah, we've been talking to our guests about what it looks like to have a dream from the Lord and how those things work out throughout your life. So Skylar, tell our listeners a little bit about how you're connected to the Refuge, how we know each other. We go way back.
Yeah, probably came to the Refuge, I don't know, like 8 years ago. Started with Club Vertical, so was volunteering over with Harris Road Middles when I first would have met Jacob. Came on staff and served as a middle school and young adult pastor. We got to help start the young adult ministry here, which used to be called Kingdom Culture, and then started serving in outreach at the Refuge and served for about 4 years on staff at the Refuge and have been off staff now for about 4 years. So
awesome. Yeah. And before that, you weren't just in ministry. What were you doing? Tell the people, they want to know.
I was a strength and conditioning coach. Originally came to Charlotte to work with women's basketball and men's tennis at UNC Charlotte.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So obviously, Skylar, we're talking about dreams. We've talked to guests about a lot of different types of dreams, and a few of them have leaned towards specifically ministry dreams. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned earlier that your ministry dream started at a young age, so you can pick up where you want to about that.
I'll see how quick I can do this. I wouldn't say it was a ministry dream, but my earliest Christian memory would literally be when I was 4 years old. We were in the basement. We were living in Dundalk, Maryland at the time, and I think we were like coloring some like Christian coloring book pages, and my sister's friend, who's older than I am, was over, and she said something about that she didn't believe in Jesus. And it was a pretty simple equation to me. You don't believe in Jesus, you go to hell. And I just remember being terrified at the thought of my sister's friend not knowing Jesus, and just began to make probably a pretty broken evangelistic appeal for her to believe in Jesus and just to get me off of her back. I think by the end she said, okay, I believe. But I also remember right around that same time, there was a homeless man who lived behind one of the buildings down the street from us. And my dad took one of his coats and just asked me to participate he had given me one of those small Gideon Bibles and said, hey, we're going to put this into the pocket. Would you mind giving up your Bible? And so both of my earliest Christian memories come back to sharing the gospel in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can recall when I met you, mm-hmm. you were working a job that you didn't love. Mm-hmm. And the idea of being able to, maybe ministry isn't the right word to throw around as much as really evangelizing, I think was the mm-hmm. thing that I noticed from the get-go. You were like, I just mm-hmm. want to share the gospel. So mm-hmm. if that could be the profession also, that'd be sick, right?
Yeah.
So as you ended up, on our team, and we got to be on the youth team together from the get-go, I could tell, like, while I think we're both pastors and we have similarities, a big difference between you and I is like my heart to go out and evangelize to strangers is pretty low. I'm pretty intimidated by it. I was never comfortable with the thought. It's not something I would daydream about, but then it's the type of thing that you'd be like, no, it's fine. It'll be good. So like, what do you think over the years? Obviously, when you were young, it was already a thought, but what do you think over the years kind of like trained that up in you to be something you weren't afraid of?
Yeah, I don't think it's natural, my personality at all. I'm actually extremely introverted, was really shy, especially when I was in high school. But like straight line from 4 to like around the time I was 14 when I really personally encountered Jesus and began reading the Bible for myself, the first natural action outside of that was I need to tell my friends about Jesus. And so it was just like the natural part of that equation is there's people who don't know Jesus. I know him now. Yeah. I have to share Jesus with them. And so I think it was passion that trumped even personality. What didn't come natural to me so much as it felt like it had to be done. And I would say that's just been a strand throughout my life is, okay, I know Jesus. There's people who don't. He needs to be shared with them.
Yeah, so more the supernatural urge than just mm-hmm. you were born with it,
yeah.
which is
probably a little bit of both, but yeah.
Yeah, but no, that's more encouraging to hear because I could get similar questions about whatever my aptitude is in ministry, and often I'm like, well, there is some stuff there, but also there's this deeper desire that I don't know how to quite explain to people, but it's like I just know in the deep part of my heart, like I have to. Like, well, not have to, and like someone's forcing me, but like I need to do this. Like there's a thing there. So, obviously you had, when you were on staff, you were ministering to young teenagers who were probably wild, but then also young adults who were a different type of wild. And then you had an opportunity to minister specifically at UNCC where you're now at. What did it look like to start to really be on a more like active basis, be able to minister to students like on their campus versus maybe in a church setting?
Yeah, I think it was another natural outgrowth where maybe there wasn't like a full blueprint of how we were going to go on campus. But I actually remember a Sunday I was preaching at the Refuge, and I didn't really have a full plan for this. I hadn't asked anyone's permission, but I just found myself saying out loud in the middle of the sermon, tomorrow night I'm going to be here at such and such a time in the parking lot. If anybody wants to come with me, we're going to go into the city. We're going to share the gospel. And I had no real plan. I think 40 some people showed up, which I was really surprised by. It wasn't like a scheduled outreach. And I was like, well, getting car-sized groups of people, pray about where God would have you go in the city and let's share the gospel. We started doing that over a number of weeks, and it was impactful, but it felt like we didn't have consistent footing in any one place. And because I was working with young adults and really wanted to see that community be more than just a good gathering, but something that would really flow in and touch our generation, had a heart for the campus, but really needed connection to students before we could get on the campus. And a number of students from the campus started showing up in our young adult gatherings. So one thing kind of led to another, where we started doing a Bible study that was on the campus, and then just consistently engaging with, let's go out and have gospel conversations on the campus with the intent that we can actually plug them back into a community that's happening right there, more as a missional base. And since then, it's just kind of continued to grow from there.
Yeah. At what point do you feel like that you were kind of like in a discovery phase in that experience, right? But at what point do you feel like you were laying in bed at night thinking like, no, they're like, there's more to this. Like, this isn't just something I'm going to do this semester or whatever. Like, you started to, I always tell people like a dream really becomes a dream when you like say it out loud, you know? So kind of like you said that one day you were like, hey, we're going to go evangelize, but you didn't know what that meant.
Right.
When did you start vocalizing like, no, I think I need to be here more? Like,
yeah, it's hard to pinpoint an exact moment. I think there's a quote that Ken Helser says is that when you finish your labor, it'll be life back to you if like you're in the area of your calling. And so I could come back to when I was working on staff at the church from spending 2 hours on campus having, gospel conversations like you described. That would be terrifying to some people. I'd come back and I'd be so full of life. I'd be brimming with a testimony of, I just got to talk to this guy who didn't know Jesus. And so the desire was there to spend more time doing that, and just really looking for the avenues to engage more in that. And I think one thing just led to another. Really for us, it was like everything got shut down, during COVID for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. The campus was a ghost town. And in the fall of 2021, there was this like eye-opening moment that a window was opening up on college campuses where 50% of the students, it was unprecedented, freshmen and sophomore, had never actually lived on campus before. So these are people who had no existing community. People that we had worked with before COVID, some of our juniors and seniors were coming back. And so we really felt this invitation from the Lord. If we don't step into full-time campus right now, this opportunity in its present shape is never going to exist again. Yeah. And you really have to get a heart for the campus. You just have to embed yourself in it. You have to have a missionary mindset. And that's what we did. Is we just 5-6 days a week, I'm on campus. I office out of the library. Whatever I do it on campus. And it's really just given me more of a heart for that space. Yeah.
So tell our listeners a little bit about what you're actually doing day to day, a little bit about Ignite and what that looks like.
Yeah. So really our vision is to see cities and campuses transformed by the reality of the gospel. We do that by establishing and advancing vibrant Christian communities in those spaces. And so kind of a typical week, which might be helpful to describe what we do, is Sunday night, we would gather for what we call large group gatherings. There's student-led worship, myself or one of our student leaders or a guest. We'll share a gospel-based message, and then students stick around to fellowship afterwards. And then throughout the week, we'll do multiple prayer meetings during the week. We have hours of evangelism spread out throughout the week. We have almost 30, we call them student leaders, but they're really students who have just said yes to a more intentional level of disciple making, that are leading student-led Bible studies spread out all throughout the campus. So some of them are meeting in dorms, some of them are meeting in classrooms, but really just trying to saturate the campus with a gospel influence. And then I'm meeting with those students throughout the week. And then I also work with a network of our campuses throughout the Southeast that spreads from North Carolina down through Florida, really with the same heart and intention, is to establish intercessory prayer on campuses, unto evangelism, unto disciple making, and communities that are worshiping Jesus together.
Roughly how many campuses is Ignite on? You said the Southeast?
Yeah. So officially 4 that would be called Ignite. And then we have a network that's called like Ignite Friends that would include several other campuses that connect with a lot of what we're doing and are plugged in with our activities.
Yeah. Awesome. So coming from a background of having done some ministry in church, where even young adults would come to the building and you have the service, that whole experience, what is kind of the stark difference of ministering to them right there on their campus?
Yeah, the language we've been using is like establish beachheads for the gospel, which is like a military phrase. So you think about like Normandy as like, okay, we're going to free up this beach and that's going to give us access to the rest of France. It's going to give us a way to plant the flag, so to speak. And so when I think about like consistent intercessory prayer and evangelism, is establish a beachhead for the gospel where it's not about conquest, it's about liberate these places where hell has set up its gates, so to speak, places that would not have a gospel influence if it were not for the church showing up there. And so really it's more of a missionary mindset is we're going to go in, we're going to form a community that's going to disciple students to immediately turn around and go and reach their peers in the classroom, on the intramural field, in their dorms or their apartments with the gospel. And so really it's like a very rapid turnaround of this person just met Jesus. Who do you know who doesn't know Jesus? Go share Jesus with that person.
Yeah.
And so really it's like not only living as if a missionary, but also trying to raise up a community of everybody who has that mindset. And so with that, when people ask like how the ministry is going, we never separate what's going on in the community from how the campus itself is doing. Like we're contending for the day where we can say UNC Charlotte is different because Christian communities are here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just for some context, our church partners with what Ignite does. And so even like our students who in our discipleship program often get to go out onto the campus and do evangelism with Skylar and his students. And I get to hear feedback from that often. And we'll hear testimonies of like, yeah, I was on campus the other day talking with this man I never met. And he was asking all these questions about the gospel. And I think what I'm always impacted by is the curiosity that's there. I think if you did the same thing in Walmart, you could maybe have the same effect. I don't know. But people are there for their groceries or whatever. People are at college to discover something, right? They're trying to learn. They're trying to figure out who they are. So I think it is such a like primed environment to be ready for an answer, you know? Talk a little bit about a couple big wins and maybe some big challenges as you've been doing campus ministry. And this, you know, we've been talking about this theme of dreams. So this is something that kind of over time, maybe you stumbled into, or it just kind of all worked out and now you found yourself there. Like I think what's hard to explain to people is like, once a dream's been birthed, you don't really just always like check it off. It like continues to grow and change, you know? And so as you face some wins or challenges, how's that dream shifted? How's your mentality towards it looked?
Yeah, it's like, I guess I'll start with the challenge is like, I think most of us with our ego too strongly intact show up and we're like, I've got a lot of enthusiasm. My heart is burning for this. I've got some strategy, and that's going to equal massive breakthrough and revival in 6 months. And I remember almost a taunt from the enemy is like in the first 2 years, I would park off campus to save money. And I'd have this long walk back from where we were doing like gospel conversations. I'd be carrying this whiteboard, which we use to start gospel conversations. And off to the right, I would see the dorms where thousands of students are living. And it'd almost be this question of like, nobody got saved today. And you think you're going to impact this whole campus. Yeah. There's thousands of people living right there. And again, it's like, even if you got 10 people saved today, you're a drop in the bucket, nothing you're doing. And I think that puts us in touch with our actual like desperation for God to move, which is really necessary to get ourselves out of the way so that we can become in touch with God in the place of prayer. But some of the wins in that is, I think if we were to look at trajectory of the last couple of years, and my timeline might be slightly off, is like year 2, I think it was the last 5 days of the school year where we saw somebody getting saved or multiple people getting saved almost every single day. Yeah. At our last gathering we did outdoor, we saw 16 students get baptized like right on campus. That's awesome. One of them got saved that very night and then like stepped into the water, took off his socks and got into the baptismal tank. I think the next year, I don't know the exact number, but probably around somewhere like 25 students got saved. And then in the first half of this school year, we've seen 40 students respond to the gospel. So there's been this trajectory of more and more students responding, increased receptivity. And part of that is just engaging more students. Jesus said the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And so more and more I'm seeing my role as like raising up and being involved in that process of getting more laborers on the field.
Yeah. And so I would assume in comparison to youth ministry, the number in college thrown around, which is a decade ago, but it was always like, youth pastor lasts 18 months. So a year and a half, you're talking over the course of high school, 4 years, which would be the same as college. Like that means your youth pastor was there for your freshman and half your sophomore year, like barely enough time to impact. So with having been part of UNCC earlier in the Kingdom Culture days, and then now, like you have some years there, what do you see as the value of the multiple years? Is it exactly what you're talking about? The growth of each year, there being more impact?
Yeah, it's the dream is multiplication. It's the exponential growth that happens through, if we'll take these first couple years to invest in a group of students who will buy into a culture of intercessory prayer, of consistent sowing and evangelism, of multiplying themselves through discipleship. It's like compound interest in finances, is that this is going to snowball, and eventually we're going to see more and more disciples being multiplied.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like you just have to have the longevity of that, and just God does something in us through the faithfulness of consistently showing up, both in like marrying our heart to a place and to a people. One of my dreams for the campus is that every person who attends there would at least have the opportunity to hear the gospel before they graduate.
Yeah.
And that comes out of Acts 19. It says, like, after 2 years of daily discussions in the lecture hall of Tyrannus, the entire province of Asia had heard the word of the Lord. And I'm like, man, Paul's just going into the same place every day. He's having gospel conversations, probably pretty impressive most of those days and weeks in between. But the end result, and I don't think that Paul had ever talked to every single person, but the ripple effect of his faithful ministry in that place was that an entire region had heard the word of the Lord. And so we're contending for that day where through faithful and consistent gospel presence, we could say this whole campus has heard the word of the Lord.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned baptisms, and I know of a specific story involving a truck and a lot of water. Can we just hear a little bit of that story?
Yeah, suspension is still intact, but essentially, how did we get to that point? Well, basically we had tried to do apartment baptisms, and usually we would do it like right after a gathering would take place, because we're very much of the mentality, if somebody says they want to get baptized, we don't want to sit on that for a long time. And so if we can't do it the same night, we'll try to do it within a week or two. And so we try to move our whole gathering, 100 plus students, to an apartment complex, but getting everybody there, making sure all the people who are getting baptized are in the right place, that you've had a conversation with them, takes some time. So we got kicked out by security one night, relocated to another place. That felt kind of sketchy. Like, okay, apartments are out. We can't do apartments. We had been told by the university we couldn't use the rec center. I'm sure bringing that many people in there was going to be too much. And we didn't have access to water where we were going to be at. And so we're like, well, we'll just find somebody who lives nearby, ask if we can pre-fill the tank, put it in the back of a pickup truck, and I'll just drive behind it. And I was just watching the back of this truck bounce as we rode onto campus, and water splash everywhere. And the thing weighed like well over a ton, and there was no way we were getting that out of the tank. And so we just left it in the back of the truck bed and just did baptisms on a parking deck rooftop at the end of the semester.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine if you tried to move it off the truck, more things would have broken.
Absolutely.
I think that while that story is funny, but it's also like pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's something to say about that type of ministry, especially with students who students are broke, right? Students don't have money. And so you don't it's not like they're going to be like, yeah, dude, I'll pay for whatever. I think there's something to be said about the resourcefulness of like, isn't really about the baptismal or the apartment pool or whatever it is. It's just about the like wanting to follow through with the fact, like, I'm going to get baptized. Maybe it's in the UCC fountain, but like, we're going to do it.
We need a deeper fountain. If anybody wants to invest in a deeper fountain on campus, it'd be very useful.
You get baptized anytime.
Yeah.
So as you're seeing students like really make the change, right? And like be like, no, I'm a believer now. And that can be a bizarre thing. I can remember a student telling me a few years back, like, well, yeah, I'm a Christian now. And he'd been in a small group for a while and, was always kind of like not listening. And then one day he said, no, I'm a Christian now. And fast forward to like now he became part of student leadership and really got involved and like is interested in ministry. So sometimes that student really does make the change. So do you want to share a little bit about some students? You don't have to name names, but any students that like you met them one way and now you can't almost even fathom how they're so on a different trajectory in their life?
Yeah. One, I don't have a ton of the foreknowledge of who he was because this happened at the beginning of the semester, but he's the first student that comes to mind. He was a freshman. So the night I met him, I think was the night that he gave his life to Jesus. But it's been convicting and challenging to me because I think we stay in the faith for a while and we just don't respond to things as quickly.
Yeah.
And it got back around to me through some of the guys that were meeting and discipling with him is like, whatever we talk about in Bible study or whatever is shared on a Sunday night, he immediately does it. And so, for example, I had like not calling anybody to actually do this. I was just sharing a story for the sake of illustration about a season of my life where I would lay on my face on a blanket. So I actually brought the blanket and just described kind of a posture of contending prayer, just laying on our face before God. Well, it got back around to me is that this guy had actually gone out and bought a blanket and he's laying on his face praying. And so it's like that literal is that whatever he's so hungry to grow that after he got saved, I remember the first night after he had made a decision to follow Jesus, he just comes up to me and goes, so how do I start that conversation? I was like, what do you mean? He goes, how do I start to talk to God? He didn't own a Bible. He didn't know how to start a conversation. We got like that fresh, that raw. And so it's really encouraging to be in spaces where students are that fresh and just so eager to grow and learn.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said about when a lot of your model relies upon like weekly or frequent evangelism, that you're just showing these students like what they can do. I think that's almost what's hard about being in a church setting is while we can view it as evangelism because they've come in the building and they're listening, we can't very easily show them like, no, we're sharing the gospel right now in a setting that's not church without doing like what you did and saying like, come meet me in Charlotte and we'll do it. But how have you seen that? Like, has that had a domino on your students? Do you see any difference between like young adults in a church setting versus in a school setting of like a more aptitude to evangelize?
Yeah, I think it's just become part of the culture of our community is because we are consistently and weekly in the same places, kind of trying to establish that beachhead for the gospel it's really easy. And it's like a communal thing. So it's like you're going out by yourself is just to say like, oh, even if I can only give 30 minutes, our group is standing out there right now during this time. Yeah. And even just like suffering rejection from somebody or somebody walking by acting like they didn't hear you doesn't sting as bad when you're doing it in community. True. And so I think we've just taken something that's uncomfortable and that we're not sure how to do and just made it familiar and given it the context of community, which I think softens some of the like intimidation of like, how do I share my faith?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's just become more of a cultural value.
I would hope that some people who have been fasting over these 21 days may have felt a stirring towards simply evangelism. And I say simply because we kind of boil it down to it being simple because it is. You just got to share the gospel. But there is like strategy to it, right? Like getting out there is the simple part. But like then what do you actually say? That's the strategy. So how would you encourage someone who is feeling that call but is like, okay, but now what's my strategy? How do I go about it? How do I deal with the hard questions? Any main things you picked up?
Yeah, I mean, on one, like you said, is just start. And so there's different, I mean, my advice would differ based on like the context and the setting. So it would look different based on if you're in work or school versus like you're actually going out like we do for an established place. Yeah. We're breaking the ice pretty quick. We immediately are starting with Jesus conversations with complete strangers. But I think asking questions is probably the biggest, both prayer and asking questions are the two things. So pray beforehand because we can share the gospel, but we can't save a soul. It's God who saves. It's God who draws people to his son. It's the Holy Spirit who reveals Jesus. And so everything we do needs to be bathed in prayer that prepares our heart to respond correctly, makes us sensitive to the leading of the prompting of the Holy Spirit, and it prepares the hearts of the people we're going to speak to. But then also, I forget the exact number, but I read this recently that Jesus responded with something like 300 questions across the four gospels and only ever directly answered 8 questions. And so you think about that, most of us want to give presentations, but if you can lead people into self-discovery by asking good questions, like we train our students, we got this from the North American Mission Board in gospel appointments. So this would be like, say you set up a 30-minute coffee or lunch with somebody. The leading question would be, after you get to know somebody, what's your spiritual background? And you just zip it. You don't talk during this time. You just let them share Christian, non-Christian, spiritual, non-spiritual, just what was your upbringing in all things considered. And then afterwards you say, can I share my story? This is your testimony. And then after that, just be prepared to give a 2-minute gospel presentation. I think it is important to get comfortable sharing the gospel. You need to know the gospel.
Yeah.
There's a guy, Paul Ooster, who says, that famous quote that preach the gospel always and when necessary use words. He says, like, that's the equivalent of saying, feed the starving and when necessary use words. And so the gospel is a message and it requires articulation, and we have to get comfortable in sharing in a concise manner what is the nature of the gospel and how should people respond to it.
Yeah. When you were describing like what's your spiritual background as the key question, I just couldn't help but think of how that's a good example of something that's simple.
Yeah.
Because even if you start with like, the classic questions like, are you a Christian or do you go to church? Even those questions could sound simple because you're a Christian, but not necessarily to the other person. So by keeping it more broad, I think you really are setting yourself up to be like, awesome, I've listened. Now I can share mine. It's that's how conversation works. It's a exchange. So as we're kind of wrapping up Selah as a whole in this episode, how could the listeners be praying for people like you who are trying to minister to the next generation, right? Like there are a number of people across the U.S. who are doing very similar things, and all are facing struggle and disappointment, but also hopefully victories. How can we be interceding for our like fellow believers who are out there evangelizing on these school campuses? Because ultimately, like we can like just pray and say like, Lord, let the next generation know the Lord. But how can we pray for people like you who are out there sharing the gospel?
Yeah, pray for people to stay encouraged. So like the analogy I use a lot of times with our students is, imagine that you're trying to have a quiet time in Times Square. Like it's not going to be super effective. You're going to be constantly distracted. And now flip the analogy and you come on a college campus, the billboards may not be as apparent, but the spiritual atmosphere is every bit as real. And everything is wired to make you feel like the message you're sharing, the life that you're trying to live, to just wash it away in spiritual apathy. Because 90% of the people around you, maybe even a higher percentage, could care less. And you start to feel like an island, and you start to feel a little bit crazy that I'm the only person out here trying to, you're not the only one, it's like Elijah, you're not the only one. But the temptation is to start to feel like, does this even matter? Do people even care? Does this work? And to keep people's hearts engaged in that by remembering the reality of the gospel is that Jesus came, Jesus died, he rose again, and he will one day return. Yeah. This is ultimate reality, and everything I do is rooted in ultimate reality. So I would pray for people's hearts to stay encouraged and to stay faithful and consistent in the work, and then just contend for breakthrough. At the end of the day, what we need is the people we're preaching to, we're pointing to the sun, and they have, according to 2 Corinthians 4, they have blind eyes. We're preaching to people to turn from their sin and put faith in Jesus. According to the Bible, they have deaf ears. And so what we need is something that we, in and of ourselves, apart from the work of the Spirit, cannot do. Is we need their eyes to be unveiled, we need their ears to be open, their hearts to be softened, to be able to respond to the gospel. And so just pray for open doors of effective ministry, for open hearts. As people are consistently engaging, that God would make a way for the gospel to go forth.
And lastly, maybe a deeper fountain on the campus.
Yeah, deeper fountain for future baptisms. Or honestly, I think we've solved that. Blow up pools.
Yeah, that's perfect.
There it is. So
awesome. Well, Scott, I appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm really hoping that even listeners across the whole season of this podcast would find stories of the people who are doing the things to send to other people doing the similar type of ministry, so that there would be an encouragement that it isn't an island, that there are believers across the U.S., across the world, who are out there being a part of the work, being a part of the harvest. And even though in your local area you could feel alone, like we're all in this together.
Amen.
So we just want to thank you guys for tuning in, and we just want to be encouraging. If you're not a part of the Refuge and you're local to North Carolina, we'd love to have you. Or if you're not local, that you could watch us online. But also, more importantly, that you would let this lifestyle of prayer and fasting be something that you continue into 2025. Don't let this just be a January thing. And as you're feeling discouraged about maybe even some dreams that the Lord has been speaking to you, to really revisit those dreams, speak to the Lord about them further, keep pressing in, and vocalize it to someone. I think there's a lot of power when you share that dream with someone else because now all of a sudden you're accountable to what it is that you said. And that person's going to follow up and say, how's that progress going? And you might be surprised going into 2026 how that dream is coming to reality. So thank you for joining us. Have a blessed one.